All right, guys, we're going to get going here. All right, guys, awesome. So before we get started, any questions on anything from the past weeks or quizzes or anything that's maybe still not clear for you? Just to make sure everything becomes clear. So just to note, something I may have not mentioned clearly enough in the past is all the quizzes you do for my class, you'll always have access to your grade and what you did right or wrong after the quiz closes. That's just how it works, so that you can't share that information with someone else. So the quizzes that close like Monday at 1:30 p.m., well, at 1:31 you could see how you did. And the quizzes that close on Friday midnight, well, you could see Saturday morning how well you did, or Friday after midnight. So make sure to review. And in this first quiz, there's kind of a semi-technical glitch that happened in the sense that I kind of had a question that had one better answer than the other one, but two were kind of good, was GDP and GDP per capita. And in the end, because there was some confusion possible, I decided to modify the question for future generations and remove the GDP per capita and just kept GDP. So that became the new right question. And because of that, some people, as they review their quiz, they see that it's marked as correct, but they get 0 on 1 on that question. So if that is the case with you, just simply email me, let me know, and I will go through Moodle and go find that question in your attempt and give you that 1 point. Okay, so anytime you've done a quiz, after the quiz, just go and take a look and make sure you got all the marks that you deserve. Like, I'm not going to complain if you email me to change something. If you deserve that mark, I'll give it to you, for sure. Cool? So last week we spoke about gross domestic product, everything that revolves around gross domestic product. Today it's all about inflation and also the very short chapter that deals with kind of the replicator and just like different factors of production, which we'll touch briefly afterwards. The big goal here is just to talk about inflation in general and different ways that we can calculate it. So in this whole discussion here, we're going to be comparing CPI versus GDP deflator kind of inflation. And just try to think, in this past year, it's an interesting year. Like, it's not a fun year not to be able to travel as much and having to wear masks and everything. But it's an interesting year for things have changed. And we kind of, it's out of the ordinary, so it kind of gives us different examples. So I just did a microeconomics class, and it was cool to see like changes in market equilibrium that happen through these COVID times. What industries have seen an increase in demand, which ones have seen a drop, and its influence on price and quantity. While here in macro, we don't really look at those micro shifts. But when we think about CPI versus GDP inflation, we're looking at the general increase in the price level of goods. So the word inflation is talking about not just the price of this marker has gone up, it's inflation. No, inflation is when we kind of encompass a ton of goods out there and we say that basket of goods, if we're talking about CPI, or what we're producing, if we're talking about GDP deflator, has gone up by a certain percentage. If there's an overall upward trend in the prices in the economy, that is inflation. So let's kind of discuss this whole inflation idea, and let's try to think, not necessarily good by good, but let's try to see what goods in this last 6 months may have fluctuated in prices more than usual. Because typically, if you buy like a water bottle, a marker, or anything else, you could expect it to go up roughly 2% per year, which is the target inflation rate. We'll talk more about that later in the semester. What's the target inflation rate by the Government of Canada, the Bank of Canada, to have 2% inflation per year? So if your wages go up 2% or the things you goes up 2%, or maybe it doesn't go up for a few years and then it goes up 10% after 5 years, that's roughly the same thing. So maybe getting a massage used to be like 60 and then 10 years later it's 65 and so on and so forth, more or less. That's normal as well if you don't want to always adjust the prices. So in this past 6 months, what are things that have fluctuated in price more or less? Yeah. And it could have gone down as well. It doesn't have to be inflation. What are the big things that change in price? Yeah.
I'd say like a lot of services.
Like what?
When businesses are trying to stay open and, either need to pay their employees.
Just give me a very concrete example.
Sanitization fees?
Sanitization fees? Maybe there's more demand for sanitation services, and those services are now more costly, is what you're trying to get across?
Well, if you want to go get your eyes examined, you have to pay $12 for the sanitization.
Okay, the extra fees now. So yeah, sanitization fees, that could be, or they often call it COVID fees.
Yeah.
Okay, COVID fees. So this, you could see for the eyes, massage therapist. I have a membership at the spa, and there used to be COVID fees. They just kind of removed it, but they added an extra fee even though you had a membership. So all of these are like roughly $5, $10 each. What's it for? Why are they instating this? It's not just, it could be perceived that they're just trying to make more money off of it, but what's the main reason? The extra cost or the extra time and space and everything. So a massage therapist has to kind of like clean up every time. And same thing for here. We didn't change our fees, but like I sit here between my two classes, and there's always like a group of people who clean the class between every class. That's why we have at least half-hour block between each classes this semester. So yeah, so extra sanitization costs. Yeah.
We saw the price of petroleum go down.
Yeah. So price of gasoline.
Was dumping on the
Where
market.
specifically the Canadian barrel
Went down. So what's the cause of the price of the gasoline going down?
It wasn't the price, it was between OPEC and Russia, I think.
Okay, so part of it is that, for sure. That's one of the reasons why the price can go down if there's an increase in supply. But there's something else as well. Huh?
Dumping?
That could happen, but there's something else. Huh?
The demand came down as well.
Why did the demand for gasoline change? Because it's going to have an influence on other industries other than just gasoline.
People work from home all the time.
People work from home, so less demand due to people driving less. We're not able to travel as much. We're working from home, so less travel, more work from home.
Didn't Trump consider it to be dumping and bought all the oil with his own personal accounts
That's
to make it off distribution?
there's a lot associated to that. But at the end of the day, when the prices go down and you have refineries that aren't at full capacity, you can purchase more because you think this is a bargain. But if it was such a great move, it would have spiked back up afterwards, but it hasn't. So it's not really, it wasn't a short-term bargain kind of thing. Like, it's been low for a while for many reasons. And one of them is because people drive less and there's less demand for it. And yes, there's other discussions on that extra supply for sure. Yeah.
Food at restaurant.
Food at restaurant, how did that change?
Why? Because
No, where did it go up or down the price? Up. Where?
Restaurant have to survive. I mean, if they have to cut the 50% of the place in the restaurant, they have to upper their price if they want to survive, or make the luxury or some stuff like that.
Can you give me an example of a restaurant that changed their prices? Because honestly, I haven't gone out to many restaurants since the beginning of COVID, but all of the ones I went to haven't changed their price.
For my part, I was surprised when I go to the Exi.
Exki changed their price? Okay.
I don't know if they have a big difference because I don't do a lot of time at restaurants too, but I was surprised. I mean,
Does anyone else have experience with the prices going up at the restaurant?
No.
Yeah, so I'm not sure it has gone up, to be honest, at the restaurant, because there's two parts associated to an increase in price. You can increase price because you're seeing less people and you're hoping to make up for that lost revenue. But increasing price could also make people come less to your restaurant. So I'm not sure how many restaurants actually increase their price. The ones I kind of went to didn't change their price, but it might be that some did. I'm not sure. Yeah.
I think maybe the cost of buying food from restaurants, given that a lot of people have been using these food delivery apps, and then maybe certain fees that those apps might be charging on top of just the cost of the, I'm not.
But that's a different service when you're talking about that. It's not the actual food that's changed in price.
Well,
and
no,
here,
I was just
yeah,
as another thing.
yeah. And here the focus here is really discussing the different things that have gone up and down in price. So if you're having a different good with a service, it's going to change it. Yeah.
Toilet paper went up.
I know like I'll call them, I guess, toys. So maybe like dirt bikes, side by sides. Maybe I don't know if cars would fit into that.
Not so much cars, but yeah, the
but
rest.
The demand for that has gone up like substantially.
Yeah.
Yeah, bikes go in the same category. All the dealers are sold out. You know, you can't get your hands on anything. Like the craziest is like Sea-Doos this summer. You can't find anywhere. You know, the used market too. Prices, like I've been told, you want to add maybe $2,000 on your sale.
Yeah, that's crazy.
It's absolutely nuts.
Yeah. For myself, like I have a 4x4 I bought like 7 or 8 years ago, and I could have easily sold it this summer for more than I paid for it 7 or 8 years ago.
I'm gonna sell my dirt bike this weekend.
Yeah.
I'm selling it for $2,000, about more than
What you paid for it.
Yeah,
it's crazy. So that's a good point. So what are seen as toys? So like I wouldn't call them toys as much as like different ways to entertain yourself when you're stuck at home or like in close proximity. We can't travel as much as we used to. So there's all the mechanical toys, but then there's all the stand-up paddle boards, even bicycles, and all of that has gone up a lot. So what's the main thing that drives that increase in demand for those products? Huh? Boredom being no more traveling. So a lot of people had money aside to go travel. They didn't travel, so now they're using that money to entertain themselves at home. So a lot of those things have increased in price. I have a buddy who sells stereos, and he said like it's insane the amount of people who are updated their home theater sound systems this summer just because they're stuck at home. Decks, for the longest time, like you couldn't find any treated wood anywhere to build your own deck because everyone was doing it. We've been wanting to have chickens forever, and then early on this summer we couldn't get any, and like some that would normally cost like $2-3, some people are trying to sell it for $50 on Kijiji. It was like insane, like just because everyone wanted chickens. So it's yeah.
We also saw the household operations costs go up or be transferred towards household owners, because instead of people going to work, they're conditioning the house and upgrading the Wi-Fi plans and all the things that require to heat a house.
Yeah, so
those costs would go up for consumers.
Yeah, exactly. So everything that's kind of home related went up. And a lot of it is just because we weren't expecting such a surge in demand. So if the businesses that are producing these Sea-Doos and everything else saw this coming, they would have just produced more and we wouldn't have had that massive spike, but it's just got wiped out. Like there was just nothing available. Yeah.
Yes, I don't know how to explain, but the price of the house.
Yeah, where?
Montreal.
I don't think we were in Quebec.
Yeah. Which parts do you think that if we think of flow of people, from where to where are people kind of flocking these days? Yeah.
Maybe the opposite, right? Like towards places like a lot of vacation homes.
Yeah, vacation homes are people because they're working more remotely are starting to come to the regions more, leaving the city. I have a few friends that kind of like sold what they had in Montreal and came to the country now. So there's shifts going on for sure, and things were selling fast there too. Like my girlfriend sold her condo on Kijiji. You know, like normally you never do that. You sell it through like by the owner or like a realtor or something else, and she just posted it, and like a week later someone was interested. I was like, what the hell? So it was an interesting time for sure. So we talked about a bunch of things that have increased, If you kind of just look at this from the get-go, you'd think, well, except for gasoline, everything we talked about increased. It would make it seem as though we'll have really high inflation this year. But do you think that's going to be the case? If you read the news, inflation could be calculated on a yearly basis, but it could also be calculated on a monthly or a several monthly basis. What's going on? Like if you look online, like what's going on with inflation?
It's a trade-off. You're buying more toys, but you're using less gas, or you're going out less at restaurants, so you're spending that money just elsewhere. It's just a shift in demand, I guess, or a shift in the way you spend.
I totally agree with you that if you have a set level of income, if you didn't lose your job or didn't get your job reduced somehow, you have that same amount of money, so that money is being spent elsewhere. So from a GDP standpoint, you're still consuming as much as before, just shifting from maybe restaurant to like a toy-ish kind of a situation. But from an inflation standpoint, we're not necessarily looking so much at the production side of things, but we're looking more at how the cost of a basket of goods sold changes. And the things that we produce in terms of GDP, what's the happen to that price? Do we expect it to go up or down, generally speaking? Are we going to be in that? Normally, the government, the Bank of Canada, aims what we call a 1 to 3% inflation target, 2% being the midpoint. And that inflation target is based on normally on what we call core inflation. So 2% a target on core inflation. And that 2% target on core inflation, what we mean by core inflation versus like general consumer price index inflation, is we're kind of trying to remove, if I will never ask you exactly what you remove from the general inflation to become core, but just remember it that you remove the most volatile components. So typically things like gas are somewhat removed, but not necessarily the impact that gas may have. So giving you guys an example, if the price of gas goes up drastically, well, maybe the price of flights will go up because there'll be a fuel surcharge. Maybe the price of shipping different items that you might order from abroad or anything else might go up because shipping fees will be higher. So those things might still have an influence on on inflation, but the actual price of gas is often kind of removed somewhat because a few years ago, like gasoline was like closer to $1.50, and now we're more at $1.05. So that would create a massive swing in inflation if we would always include it, because if it goes back up to $1.50, it's as if we had 50% inflation, which is really big. So we have the 2% core inflation. So what's going to happen, you guys think?
Well, the government also did some spending, which is not going to add value to the GDP. So those housings that did lose their job or did not work and bring income in through working might actually cause the GDP to decrease.
When government spends, it contributes to GDP. It's when we transfer money that it doesn't contribute to GDP.
Like I'm talking about this
PCU? Yeah, so that's transfer. That I agree that wouldn't contribute, but if the government goes through different initiatives, then if it's not a transfer, then it counts. If the government decides to build a bridge or build a new building, it counts. But if the government just transfers money, yeah, I agree. We could definitely expect, because certain industries did suffer, that GDP is likely going to fall to some extent this year compared to other years, for sure. But that was the topic last week. This week's topic is more around the price side of things. So inflation. So we talked about a bunch of things that may have gone up in price. Are there anything else that may have fallen or been stable? Plane tickets have fallen for sure. If you were to try to book a flight, the plane tickets would fall. Probably if you're in the market to buy a Boeing, it'd probably be cheaper than before because there's just not much market for it right now. a bunch of things that are travel related. Like if you think of all the industries that are suffering, those ones would have a drop in price or a drop in production there. Anything else? No? So from a general standpoint here, you might think that it might increase, but there's going to be other things that will make it decrease. So in a second, I'll have you guys just take a moment, take like a time out and look at your phone if you want or your computer, and just try to see if you could find anything on the news recently and that talks about inflation, either CPI inflation or GDP deflator inflation, which we'll go through in a second, and try to see what's expected, what's happened in the last few months, because this COVID crisis has been in pretty much full effect since April, so it's been long enough that we can see what happened on prices and inflation. So take a look. Yeah, you.
CBC said the inflation rate was pretty much nil.
Yeah, so 0%, 0.1%. For how long of a period is that talking about?
They said August.
So just for 1 month?
Yeah.
Okay, so 0 to 1.1% for 1 month is less of a big deal. If it was 0 to 0.1% on an annual basis, it'd be a bigger deal because then it's far from 2%, but 0.1 times 12 is like 1.2. It's not that far, yeah.
Why do you need 2% inflation a year?
Okay, that's a very good question. You don't need 2% inflation, but that's just been our target since 1995. What I mean by been our target, it's not my target, but the government, the Bank of Canada's target since 95 has been a 2% target. And they have the opportunity to modify that target every 5 years, I believe. And then once they set that target for the next 5 years, they try to maintain it. And since 1995, like we're on 2020, so pretty much 25 years in, they've had multiple opportunities to change this kind of target range, and they haven't. So we could if we wanted to, but they don't for different reasons. And we'll go through a bunch of these reasons in this class, but I'll just illustrate a few right now. The big reason is that we prefer to have small inflation than small deflation, which would be the opposite, would be like a negative percentage, based on the fact that when there's small inflation, you're always more tempted to buy something sooner than later. So let's say you're thinking about buying, like I'm building my house now, but let's say that the person who's supplying any kind of material you need to build a house says, okay, we're nearing the end of our calendar year, whatever time of the year it is for them, and we're about to increase the prices by 2% because we're following inflation and so on and so forth, our building materials. Well, if I see that coming, I'll be more tempted to buy now than buy later, even though it's only 2%. It's going to create an incentive to buy. Whereas if I expect prices to go down by 2% or go down by a larger amount than 2%, people have a tendency to delay their purchase. Because unless you really need it now, might as well buy it later. It's cheaper. So the problem with deflation is that it makes people kind of push away their purchase to later. And if a lot of people do that, it leads to very little consumption, and it leads to a situation where then those people that aren't consuming might lead to less products being produced. Those people lose their jobs, which leads to less consumption and might lead to this chain reaction, which is unfavorable. So typically in a recession, we have deflation, but we try to stop that as soon as possible, because otherwise it just turns into this spiral that is very negative to the economy, because as more and more people delay their purchases, more and more people lose their jobs, which means that more and more prices go down because more and more people don't have a job, which leads to more and more people delaying their purchases because they expect it to be even cheaper, and it just spirals through. So having negative inflation is not good. The only thing I would say is then you want to have a range, because to always set the same target, it would be hard. I would argue that if they wanted to make things different in Canada, I'd say, well, instead of having this 1 to 3% range, they could say, well, let's go between 0 and 2%, and being 1% our target. That would also be acceptable. Okay? But later on, we'll see as well that positive inflation may be good in times of recession, when people aren't willing to accept lower wages, but they're willing to keep their wages fixed, but there's still inflation, so it's essentially your wages are going down. But it's much easier pill to swallow than to say, I'm going to accept lower wages to do the same job as before. And we'll get back to that later on. It's going to become clearer, but there's a few reasons why that's the case. Essentially, we have that target, and we've had it for a while, and we'll say why as well in the semester. You'll learn much more about inflation. Here, this chapter was mostly focused on calculating inflation, but later on we'll understand why we want to try to stay as constant as possible with our inflation. Otherwise, it has really bad repercussions if it changes inflation expectations. And that's like at the very end. It's like chapter 16 is what we cover. So yeah. The question.
Essentially, does it really matter what the rate of inflation actually is?
Yeah, it does.
Because basically from what I get from what you're saying is it's more about the circulation of money than it is about the actual rate of inflation. Because if money is circulating, then if people are not holding on to their money and they're actually spending, then the inflation affects the economy in a less bad way.
But you want to make sure that the economy keeps on running. That's for sure is one of the big deals. But then afterwards, you want to make sure that inflation is relatively stable, or else we'll see later on, but you'll get people that will get kind of screwed over by high levels of inflation. Imagine that you're just about to retire and you have $1 million in the bank. And all of a sudden the government's like, we want to make sure that we're getting reelected, so we're just going to stimulate the economy like crazy. And all of a sudden you create 100% inflation, way off 2% target. Well, that means that everything that was sold for a certain price last year sells for double the year after. And imagine in your bank account you only have $1 million. Well, $1 million's not only $1 million, but you have $1 million. Well, last year with that $1 million, you were able to buy a certain amount of goods, and the year after, you're only able to buy half the amount of those goods. It's something that you wouldn't like to see, and it would have a lot of bad repercussions as well. So there's a lot more to it than just kind of this arbitrary goal. There is reasons to keeping it steady that are more we'll talk about later. Yeah.
Yeah, you've seen examples through history where
hyperinflation, super bad. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You after. Yeah.
It's not a concern though if there always is inflation that wages aren't always adjusted based on inflation. Like in Ontario, teachers they just got their 1% every year, but that's not inflation. Or people with the minimum wage, that is not inflated every year. So there's not a concern that certain people will be falling below the cracks because the CPI is increasing, but their wages aren't.
I agree with that. I think minimum wage, generally speaking, has more or less followed inflation, is my impression. What is minimum wage now here in Quebec? Anyone know? Around 11, 12, 13? 13? Okay, so I'm not that old, but when I was young, minimum wage was 7. So between 7 and 13, we're almost double for 20 years, more or less. So 20 years at 2%, it's compounding. It's not just 20 times 2. You have to do 1.02 to the power 20 to know what the actual percentage is. But it would be less than 100%. And I'd expect, I'd have to calculate it. But it's pretty close to it. It's pretty close to inflation for minimum wage. But I agree with you that certain professions haven't followed. I've taught snowboarding pretty much my whole life, and I started teaching it when I was 16. And when I started teaching, I was getting paid $10 an hour, where minimum wage was $7 an hour. So I was getting paid roughly 50% more than working at a grocery store. But you don't teach 8-hour days, normally when you're coaching. But over the years, minimum wage has gone up, and then the salaries of snowboard instructors barely changed, that they're now pretty much at minimum wage. Like most people that I've seen that still work in that industry as an instructor, if they just have level 1, they're pretty much close to minimum wage. So those people kind of lost over the years through CPI. In the past, even though you'd only work like 5-6 hours a day as an instructor, you'd still earn a decent enough wage relative to someone working in a grocery store or something else. It's no longer the case as much. But there is, if you work for a good business, they try to follow in a CPI as much as possible. Here we've had years that I didn't follow so much, but I'm still a snowboard instructor, evaluator, and they try to follow it as much as possible. So my wages as an instructor, evaluator still go up with inflation. So that depends, but yes, you do lose people through the cracks over time in that process sometimes. So some professions are not as good over the years in terms of real wages than they used to be when you started doing it, potentially. But that's a different kind of problem, you know. Like it's, I know inflation makes it easy for some of the businesses to just not offer salary increases year after year. If there wasn't an inflation, they wouldn't have that option. But if there was an inflation and they had a lot of people wanting to work as a snowboard instructor, let's say, they could still say, oh, we're not at minimum wage yet, so we're going to drop our wages just because there's so many people applying for a job right now. So there's a lot more than just inflation. There's just like the forces of labor willing to work and everything else. In times like COVID, like if for sanitary reasons, like if there's definitely some professions that were maybe not as popular before or not as in demand, but now they're able to negotiate higher wages. You think of the people working at the CHSLD and everything else, like I forget the name, but they negotiated better this year than normally, you know. Like so. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
Can the government consistently hit the 2% mark there?
It's pretty close. Yeah, they're pretty close at it, to be honest. Over the years, huh?
They do predictions.
Well,
See how much money to put it within the economy to not bust over.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. Like we'll talk about this when we talk about monetary and fiscal policy, that it's a tricky process because even though the economy might be recovering, but it hasn't fully recovered yet, sometimes you don't want to inject too much more money because otherwise the impact on sales and production happens within the next year, but the impact on prices can happen in another year down the road. So you're trying to look through a crystal ball as you're doing this as much as possible, and you're hoping that you're doing it right. And that's why there's a lot of people employed at the Bank of Canada. But like on the in the notes, like I don't know if it's for this chapter or another chapter, but I used kind of like one of the graphs from the textbook, and you could see many years and you could see the fluctuation. I'm pretty sure it's just this chapter, and you could see that like the actual core inflation was always within that range for all of those years. So yeah.
With inflation, the currency, like the dollar, loses its value every year, right?
It loses its value every year relative to other countries that don't have inflation. If they both have the same level of inflation, it doesn't. It's the same. Yeah. And that's a big thing that we'll discuss later on. You guys are kind of bringing to everywhere we're going to go in this class during the semester. And it's super interesting that you're bringing those points out. But yes, the exchange rate will be determined based on many things. But if one country has high levels of inflation and the other one has low levels of inflation, the one that has high levels of inflation, their money is worth less. So if they want the other person's dollar bills or something, they'll have to give more than before. And it kind of comes back to the idea, like I said before, if there's a lot of inflation and you have $1 million aside, that million won't be able to purchase as many goods as before. Same thing as with that $1 million, you can't just say, oh, I'm going to move to another country and I'll be just as good. No, because there's had so much inflation, not only can you buy less here, but if you try to transfer that currency into another currency, it's going to be worth less as well, so you won't be able to buy more elsewhere. So yeah, definitely a lot of problems with purchasing power when it comes to inflation that's out of control. Okay. Cool. All right. So the big thing here, the last kind of step here I want to well, maybe not the last one, but one of the steps I want to discuss here with you guys is the main distinction between consumer price index inflation and GDP deflator inflation. So this is consumer price index. And in the textbook, you might see how to calculate the consumer price index and how to calculate the GDP deflator. And maybe some of the assigned questions I give to you guys from the textbook, you might have this pop up as well. But for the purpose of the evaluated quizzes and the final exam in these classes, I'll never ask you to calculate the GDP deflator on its own. I'll always ask you guys these things in terms of inflation. What I mean by that is the intermediate step that the textbook sometimes does, I'm not interested in it in this class. So the intermediate step is to find, like, if this year we were producing at 100, well, what would next year be relative to that? Like, it'd be 105 or whatever. What I'm interested in when it comes to GDP deflator is I will always pi sign and macroeconomics represents inflation. So if I'm looking at inflation using the GDP deflator approach, I'm looking at nominal over real GDP for a given year. So whatever, it's the same year, it's just different prices because the base year is not the same as in the year that I'm looking at typically when I do this, minus 1 times 100. And that will give me inflation, the inflation rate. But if you don't do the minus 1 and you do times 100, then you get the GDP deflator. But like I said, I'd rather just do the minus 1 and I combine 2 steps into 1 and we're going straight to finding inflation. So if you see the other way in the textbook, it's still interesting. You could still look at it. But we're going straight towards inflation. And here the CPI inflation is the cost of the basket of goods, let's say in 2020 over the cost in 2019 minus 1 times 100. So in both cases, I'm doing a very similar process. It's quite a similar situation happening whether I'm using consumer price index or the GDP deflator approach. I'm putting something over something else, minus 1 times 100 in both cases. So the general process is the same. The big distinction here lies about what we're looking at. Here we're looking at a basket of goods that a typical consumer consumes. Roughly 600 goods that StatsCan uses that looks at the average consumer, what would he consume? A certain quantity of orange juice per week, even though you might not drink orange juice, while a typical consumer drinks orange juice, a certain amount of pasta per week, a certain amount of this, a certain amount of that, to just kind of look at this average consumer, what does this person consume? Well, in this 600 goods that a typical consumer consumes, I don't think you'll see things such as caviar or anything else there. Even though maybe some of you eat caviar every night. It's just something that a typical consumer does not consume. Okay? And maybe some of you like to have like a uranium collection at home, but most people here don't consume uranium. So there's certain things that may be produced in Canada, but are not consumed. So this is the big thing that we have to kind of set as differences here. CPI is based on a typical basket. And this is based on something consumed. And GDP deflator is based on GDP. So it's based on something produced in Canada. Something we didn't mention early on, based on the things that have fluctuated a lot in price over this last few months, wood for construction purposes has fluctuated a lot. Like I bought a lot of wood early on in the summer for construction purposes, and I bought some recently to finish some of my interior walls. And a 2x4 in April versus a 2x4 now is double the price. Plywood, everything else that is construction related has gone up drastically in the woods area. If I think of insulation and all those other things, those haven't changed in price, but wood has. Yeah.
I'm just thinking about, so say the demand for things like appliances and refrigerators, things like that, that went up significantly as well. But then obviously also the supply went down. But those things cannot fluctuate really in price because they have a set retail price depending on the fridge.
No, they'd be able to fluctuate as well, like because like my washing machine broke on me like a month or so ago, and I changed, and I had to wait longer than usual to get it, but I still paid less than retail. So like if they were limited by retail, it would have been like, I don't know how much it was worth, like $1,400, but I paid like $900 for it. So there was still the capacity for those things prices to increase. Doesn't necessarily mean that if there's a shortage that they'll necessarily bump up the price. And that was the kind of discussion I had in my previous class as well, on the idea that like a 2x4 or a piece of plywood is something that's very hard to replace. So if you decide to increase your price, you might still make those sales because let's say there's a shortage of people working on the lumber yard and there's an increase in demand. So it's easy for them to increase the price on that. But if I think of like exterior siding, which is made of wood, if you increase the price too much, well, maybe people decide to get vinyl siding, or they'll get like aluminum or brick siding or anything else. So as soon as there's that potential impact, you might not change your prices too much. So there's a lot more at play than just saying, oh, we can increase our price, we'll definitely do it. It's if you do and the other competitors don't change their prices, if you're LG or Samsung, it doesn't mean that you're going to keep on selling washers and everything else. Yeah. So if it was just one company and had full monopoly, it would be a different scenario, but it's not the case in that industry. So here, when we think about inflation, we have to determine between typical consumption and produced. So if I think about wood, like 2x4s and plywood and everything else, it would have an impact in both, but which of the two do you think it might have a bigger impact on in terms of inflation? What I mean by a bigger impact is the change in price will be the same in both scenarios, but it's going to have a different weight in both scenarios. So I'll come back to wood. It's a harder one to answer, but let's say for some reason avocados doubled in price. Which of the two inflations will that influence the most? Why not GDP deflator? Yeah, we don't produce avocados as far as I know in Canada, so it wouldn't influence GDP deflator at all. Any of the goods that you consume that are not produced in Canada, if they double or triple in price, will not have an impact on GDP deflator because they're not produced here. But if they're consumed, they'll have a big impact. If uranium doubles in price, well, we extract uranium in Canada, but we don't typically consume it. So no impact here, big impact here. 2x4s and plywood and everything else, yes, some people consume it, but how many people do you know that actually buy 2x4s on a monthly basis every year? Very seldom. So it's probably not in CPI so much, but it's definitely something that we produce in Canada. Canada has a lot of wood and produces a lot of wood that is either used here for residential purposes or used abroad. Yeah.
So people are buying Canadian gas, would that affect both?
Yeah, gasoline would affect both because it's something that we produce and it's something that we consume. If the price of a barrel of oil goes up, yes. Yeah.
So in the scenario of gas, how would that work? Because most of the gas actually used in Canada is not refined in Canada.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
So let's say it normally gets sent down to the United States and it comes back up.
Yeah.
Doesn't that count as an export and import? So doesn't this
Yeah, but it's not the same thing that's exported and imported. And once again, here we're not talking about the calculation of GDP, because then you could say they kind of cancel out, but they don't. Here, when we're talking about inflation, if the price of the barrel of oil goes up, the unrefined product that we sell to the States goes up in price, so that our production goes up due to that unrefined oil that goes somewhere else. So that would have an influence here, and the influence on the consumption would be the portion that is refined and easy to pump into your car and drive away with. So that would have the influence here. So slightly different goods, but if the unrefined goes up by 50%, I could definitely expect the refined version to go up as well. So it might have a similar impact. Yeah, well, it's two different goods that have different impacts. Yeah. Anything else? The COVID fees that we were talking about earlier, which of the two would it have an impact on? Trick question. Huh? CPI? Huh?
What was the question?
The COVID fees, the sanitary fees, which one would it have an impact on?
Maybe both.
Yeah, both. Because it's something that, like, let's say a typical consumer gets a massage a year or whatever, or goes to the eye doctor once a year. Well, it's going to have an influence here because we're going to take the eye doctor as a typical thing that's being used. But the eye doctor, we're not producing something, but we have to remember that in GDP, it's not just goods, it's goods and services. So it's something that's being provided for, and that goes up in price. So it has influence on both. Okay.
Well, if I'm Prix, I saw like just
Purell?
the Purell like $50 for like a 2 liter. I was like, that's crazy.
Really?
Yeah, $50.
Oh, wow. Sheesh.
That was like extreme.
Yeah, it sure is. That's crazy. Yeah, some businesses made money there. Yeah.
So you mentioned Stats Canada, which
Yeah.
estimates like, what a Canadian basket is size.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering what effect the basket size has on it. You know what I mean? Like how much, depending on the country.
The basket size? What do you mean by the
Does that
basket
change
size?
anything? How much people are, obviously there are countries where, I'm just saying, like, is the number different?
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily the number that's important, because let's say I compare an individual here who eats 2 liters of orange juice and 4 kilograms of pasta, and another person who has like 4 liters of orange juice and 8 kilograms of pasta, has double of both. You could say this person's like un glouton in French, like it just eats a lot. But that wouldn't change anything in terms of CPI inflation, because if I think about those two baskets, if one's just having double than the other, well, if prices go up, it's going to have the impact on both, because let's say his typical basket was $1,000 last year. His typical basket was double, so it was $2,000 last year. Well, if his basket went up to $1,500, well, his went up to $3,000. Both of them went up 50%. So the percentage, regardless of if you start from 1,000 or 2,000, doesn't change anything. What matters is the relative weights. And that's why I said, which of the two will it have a bigger impact on? Because certain things might be included in GDP deflator or CPI, but some might have weights. And if I think of avocados, has a weight in consumption, but has no weight in production. So the typical example I could give you guys in a test is I could have like 3 goods, X, Y, and Z. And I'll have like prices for 2000 and quantities if it's GDP, and then prices for 2001, whatever. And what will often change between calculating the inflation using the CPI approach or the GDP deflator approach is the weight, is the percentage of all that basket that is this good versus the percentage of the production that is this good.
But would
So-
it still be calculated in imports and in consumption within the GDP? Your avocados?
The avocados, like when we talk about imported goods, they cancel out in GDP because they count in consumption and imports, and it just becomes zero. So it wouldn't have any impact on the GDP deflator.
Even the transportation cost of it within Canada?
the transportation cost of it within Canada. Well, the transportation industry, if it's running more and it contributes more to GDP, can, but the actual consumption of the avocados would. Yeah. So in this kind of three goods framework, what you'll often see is like, let's say price in 2000, price in 2001. I'll give you a simple example. This good went from $1 to $1.50. This one went 5 to 6. This one went from 7 to 9. Okay. You'll often have a scenario like this. First thing that you should ask yourself if you're going to do this rapidly on a quiz, let's say it's a quiz question, is ask yourself, what are the inflation rates in all three? If I were to just do it on myself, you could quickly do that. So here I know that from 1 to 150, this is 50% inflation. Like the price increase here has gone up by 50%. If you're not sure, always new minus old minus 1 times 100. So 150 over 1 minus 1 times 50, 50%. 6 over 5 minus 1, This gives me 20%. And this one here, I'd have to calculate it. I don't know. Like it's a little bit more, a little bit less than a third. So 26%. Okay, yeah, thanks. 22? Somewhere around 22 or 26. Yeah, 22? Okay. I'll let you compute it really fast. So in this situation here, in this mock example that you might have to do, 28? Okay. Let's say it's 28. So in this mock example that you would have, if the multiple choice answers that are available to you are 60%, 15%, 18%, all of those things are impossible in this scenario. If it's anywhere between the smallest and the highest, it is possible. And if you want to quickly verify your thing, let's say I say my basket of goods typically consists of 10x, 100y, and 100z. Okay? In that case there, I could see that I have a bigger weight on good y and good z or z than good x. So therefore, I know that my range of inflation has to be between 20 and 50%, but because I'm consuming a lot more of these goods that are around 20 and 28% than the one that's at 50%, if I were to guess really rapidly what I expect the inflation rate to be, well, if there is none of this x being consumed, I would be at 24%. Because there's x, but it's just a small percentage, I'll be like maybe 26, 27. Like I could have an idea really rapidly what the inflation rate should be. However, if I say this is the basket that you consume, but what we produce in Canada, so what's being produced is actually 1,000x and 10y and 1z. Well, in that situation there, you could see that you're mostly producing good X, which has 50% inflation, barely any of these other two goods. So now inflation is going to be around like 48%. So why could we obtain two different inflation rates calculating that with using the two different methods? Because one is based on what's being consumed and one's being based on what's being produced. That's the end thing there. Well, any questions or comments? No? All right. Any other news that anyone kind of looked at their phones or computers based on inflation and what was being said earlier? Yeah.
Yeah, so Global News said that Canada's GDP dropped an annualized rate of 38.7% between April and June. However, at the end of year, it should have increased by 3% in real GDP.
Oh, good. But that's about GDP. Once again, talking about inflation, any news about inflation other than the one that was mentioned earlier? Yeah?
Compared to August 2019 to August 2020, there's only a 0.1% increase in inflation.
Okay, so for a whole year, so that's why I was asking that question before. The 0.1% dealt with a month or a year. So for a full year, so that means that we have very low inflation. We're really at the bottom here. And that's why you'll often see that even though some industries are going well, we're trying to find a way to have the whole economy recover as quickly as possible. So you'll see a lot of government transfers like the PCU and everything else to make sure that people are not having trouble surviving and that the economy is recovering as quickly as possible. It's a weird kind of recession because like the financial crisis of 2008 had like a lot of things happened, and now it's just because we're kind of like on standby for a second. It's not like there's nothing that crashed. It's just that we kind of had to contain, and this containment led to the production going down. But if we would have had a vaccine within like a month or two, and then we could have came back to normal, the jump back would have been really quick compared to other kind of recessions that we've had historically. So it's a different kind of one, but we'll see how things pan out over time. Any other questions or comments? Okay. I guess the last little thing I was about to forget, this is all about inflation. The last little comment is on chapter 7, which deals with a replicator. The whole kind of like, it's very quick in the notes, and it's not something you'll see too much on actual quizzes or exams, this whole chapter 7. But it's something that I want you guys to kind of always keep an eye out for it. This whole idea of how things will evolve over time, and what we're trying to do in economics classes is to get you guys have a very good eye or good rational eye on how society works, and try to see what trends are happening. And like I mentioned in microeconomics, to see like if there's a pandemic coming, knowing what industries will do well, what industries will do poorly. So if you work in finance, what companies should you invest in? If you're an individual, what companies you should invest in, even if you're not going through someone in finance. Or if you're buying products, should you buy a motorcycle really quick because you're like, oh, they're going to sell out so fast? Like, how could you try to have that crystal ball as best as possible? Well, something I want you guys to kind of think about this kind of idea of a crystal ball is trying to make sure that whatever you plan on doing once you graduate, how safe is it from automation? Because it's crazy to think how many industries are going to get kind of like switched around really fast through different technologies that happen over the years. It's very exciting by parts, but by other parts, it could be very scary for certain industries. So you have to wonder what's really the best jobs to have to make sure that you're safe once you graduate. So it's something to keep in mind. Yeah?
I have a question then on the inflation and GDP.
Yeah.
So now you said like these numbers were the GDP and not the inflation, but isn't using the GDP calculation to get the inflation?
Yes and no. Okay, I agree with you by there. I'll say yes and no. You use GDP to calculate inflation, yes. But when you calculate inflation using the GDP deflator approach, here when I use nominal and real, all that changes is my price between those two. Yeah. It's not my quantity. So let's say for some reason there's a massive economic downturn, and the quantity of, I only produce one good in Canada. We're really simple. We could only produce one thing. And that good in 2019, we were able to produce 500 units. And in 2020, we're only able to produce 250 of that. What a one product, unique product that we produce. Maple syrup, let's say. Okay, that's the only thing we produce. Well, if I were to say, well, what's inflation in 2020? And I use 2019, 2018, 2017, whatever year is my base year, I'm going to use these quantities, this unique quantity, as to calculate my nominal and my real. Okay? So it's true that you use that quantity, but if I were to calculate inflation the year before, I would use this quantity for nominal and real as well. So the only thing that creates an influence on that inflation is really the price level. It doesn't matter if there's a drop in production for that price level change, because we're trying to extract the price level change. We're trying to extract the inflation component. We're not looking at the whole impact. And that was the kind of discussion that if I go from nominal GDP in 2019 to nominal in 2020, if I go from one to the next, there's two things that happen. There's a change in price and there's a change in quantity. But if I go from nominal 2019 to real 2020, well, I know that from here to here, I have just a change in quantity. And from real to nominal, well, here I'm using the same production level, so here I only have a change in price. So I'm kind of separating that change in price and change in quantity between the two. But when I'm looking at calculating inflation using the GDP deflator approach, I'd be using 250 times whatever price. So if that was selling at $10 in the base year and now it's $15, I would still have an overall 50% inflation using the GDP deflator approach, whether my production drops or not.
Okay.
That doesn't have an impact because I'm really just trying to extract the inflation amount. If I look at real GDP trend from one year to the next, then that fully encompasses drops in production because real GDP is trying to measure what real production has changed over time. That's different. One's looking at production trends, the other one's just looking at price, the impact of price changes.
So we would have to say inflation GDP for it to count, like, because you said like to find the inflation of this year or find
Yeah.
so what would be the terminology we would have to look for within a news article or within like
If you just search for inflation.
Just inflation.
Yeah, because inflation is a general increase in the price level. So as soon as you use that, you shouldn't be talking about inflation when you're talking about changes in quantity. That's an increase in production. Inflation is often referred to that. So you could write like inflation, CPI, inflation, GDP, blah, blah, blah. And then you should be able to find some news articles that relates to that. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions or comments? No? All right, good little discussion with you guys today. That was good. I'll see you guys next week.